Thank you for auditing Professor Skye's Record Review, the only first listen new music review show hosted by a French professor who put a very provocative title on this review of Bob Dylan's new album, Rough and Rowdy Ways. Why would you listen to this? Now, I like provocative titles, but I want to reassure all of you worshipers of the undying boomer Jesus, Bob Dylan, the undead boomer Jesus, Bob Dylan. This is a positive review. I like this album, I think it's important, and I think people should listen to it. That said, it's going to be a bumpy ride because the question still needs to be asked. Why would you listen to this? I review new music on this channel. I review music made by artists that are still active and still productive. In the last month, I have reviewed many albums that are much, much better than this Bob Dylan album. That's not to say this Bob Dylan album isn't good, but I've reviewed better just in the last month. The thing that I fear is that people who don't pay enough attention to music just go and they remember a name, like a brand that they like. Oh, Bob Dylan, I like that brand. Oh, Bob Dylan came out with a new flavor? Well, it's not as good as his old flavors, but it's better than all this new junk. And they sort of allow their musical taste and look on life to just be sort of rigid and fixed in this point. And they would prefer a bad Dylan, or even a mediocre Dylan, or even a good Dylan, but not a transcendently good Dylan, to anything new that comes out. My question to you is, why would you listen to this? If you love Bob Dylan's political side, immediately go out and listen to Run the Jewels 4. That is the most politically precise, politically relevant artwork being made now. Don't listen to this Rough and Rowdy Ways. If you like genre-shifting, messianic male voices of poetic relevance and profound human insight, listen to the Perfume Genius album from last month. It's amazing. It's an amazing album, and it's better than this. Maybe you just want to hear old legends staying relevant by making Americana albums. Listen to the Steve Earle album. That is also better than this. Even if you're not into new music, Bob Dylan himself tells you you should not be listening to this album. The title of the album is after an old Jimmy Rogers song. You should listen to that. Certainly Bob Dylan would tell you you should listen to Jimmy Rogers before you listen to Bob Dylan. There's a song to a different Jimmy Reed, an entire song dedicated to the blues man. One could argue that Bob Dylan's late-stage career is trying to become a mixture between those two Jimmys, Reed and Rogers. I'm not going to make that video essay now. I think it could be made. Bob Dylan is telling you to not listen to this album. And even if you just want to listen to Bob Dylan, this is his 39th album. Have you listened to the rest of them enough? I haven't. I consider myself a Bob Dylan superfan, but I haven't listened to them enough. Shot of Love. How many times have you listened to Shot of Love? If the answer is not 100, why are you listening to Rough and Rowdy Ways? If you ignore Dylan's amazing, difficult productions from the 80s, if you haven't processed all of those, why are you jumping in here at the end with this sort of old man, wise man, boomer wisdom shtick? Why are you listening to this? Actually reminds me of one of my favorite jokes from the 80s. There used to be some rock and roll jokes I used to hear a lot. One of my favorites was, "Hey, did you hear? Bob Dylan's getting back together." I thought it was funny. So here's the answer to the question, why would you listen to this? You listen to this because Bob Dylan is important. Everything he does is worthy of study. Now listen, when I gave that negative review of A Murder Most Foul, I got a lot of people saying, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The Nobel Prize for Literature is the least important thing in Dylan's biography. It is irrelevant. Who cares about that? Truly, it is so irrelevant compared to what else he has done, compared to the revolution that he sparked, to what he brought to popular music. I would put forth as Dylan as one of America's greatest pop geniuses. I'd put him up there with Warhol and Kanye. I think that's our sort of holy trio of pop geniuses. We shouldn't have reverence for Bob Dylan. I mean, we do. I do. It's clear just in the way I'm talking. But when people talk about him, we forget that Bob Dylan doesn't like taking himself seriously. When we go back to the 60s and the interviews, and every interview he's ever given, he lies and tells half-truths and intentionally pisses off the people who are interviewing him. He is not a figure to be revered as though he's some delicate, wonderful American institution that won the Nobel Prize. Oh, we need to call him what he is, a great genius who releases great music, releases fine music, and at his worst, releases music. This album has 2 volumes. Volume 1 is the 9 songs I'm going to be reviewing now. Volume 2 is A Murder Most Foul. I opened up this video with a kind of provocative joke of calling Bob Dylan undead or undying boomer Jesus. When I say undead, I mean zombie. Artistically dead, but still coming back for more. Cashing in on that nostalgia of the generation that he allegedly defined and just saying, ugh. And he gave us that garbage track, Murder Most Foul. I don't care. Feel free. I admit I don't know as much as Bob Dylan. I am not a Bob Dylan expert. I am not a poetry expert. I am not a history expert. If you like to disagree with me by calling me an idiot, I am actually in favor of it. Please make your defense of A Murder Most Foul. For me, it is CNN the 60s as a 19-minute song that's not even a song. I think that is the blackest mark on Bob Dylan's entire discography. Just terrible. But fortunately, I've already reviewed it. Check it out. The only negative review in the history of my channel. Volume 1 does not have that problem. Volume 1 is what I call the undying boomer Jesus. He's still very much in this role of this messianic figure who tells us the truth and tells us things and leads us to mysteries that we don't know the answer to and don't get. But he's undying. He never stopped. He's not coming back to something. I talked about Shot of Love. The whole period where he was reborn, most of those boomers who are now buying the most recent album saying, oh, I love Bob Dylan, abandoned Bob Dylan in the 80s. If he's undead boomer Jesus, that was him sort of, in the garden, like wondering when is he going to be betrayed by his followers. Well, that's an extended metaphor. I don't know if I was actually ready for. I don't know if I mean that, but feel free to comment on it if you think it's a good point. But this undying aspect, the fact that he stayed relevant and made great albums consistently and always in his own way, responding to his own muse and the own way that he sees things. That's the undying Bob Dylan. And that's the Bob Dylan that I love and that I see for the majority of this album. For the most part, this album is really solid and very good. What I like about it is that he's a great poet, and part of the reason he's a great poet is that he's inscrutable. You don't always know what he means. And the problem with Bob Dylan is that sometimes I think he actually means nothing. I think he's just goofing. He is a joker. He really is. And he tells you that he's a joker, and he says it, and people don't believe him, and people want to take him so seriously. I watched a review of one of his albums the other day, and they were talking about how unbelievably wise and educated he is. He is, but I mean, he's not some academic genius. Some Shakespeare references, some Bible references, a whole bunch. I mean, he certainly knows more than just about anybody about the history of American music. But beyond that, he's not sitting in there, I don't think, going through, George Bernard Shaw's letters and like figuring out how they pertain to, I don't think so. Anyways, what I like about it is the inscrutable quality of his poetry. His poetry that says something without you knowing what it says. And that is all over this album. Now, I just said how much I dislike A Murder Most Foul. Let's jump into the album by talking about track 1, I Contain Multitudes. This is, I think, a spiritual twin of that track, of A Murder Most Foul. Like A Murder Most Foul, it's not music. It's not really a song. It's just like notes being played. There is some development at one point with just a little bit of guitar, at some point, but for the most part, it's just a blank canvas for his lyrics. But in this case, he's not talking about, and then the Beatles came, and then there was Woodstock, and then we went to disco, and then there was Studio 54, and then Ronald Reagan. Okay, it's not like that. It's basically him just referencing a whole bunch of American poets. I would argue lesser poets than himself, like the title itself, which makes reference to Walt Whitman. But what's nice here is that this idea of I contain multitudes, that comes from a Walt Whitman poem in which he's discussing his own contradictions. And I would say that's part of what makes Bob Dylan so great. Part of the reason why you would listen to this album is it's another entry into his depiction of himself as a contradictory figure. He's a very unsatisfying person to study and love because you never get the sense that you're at the real person. You're never at the real Bob. Robert, you're never there. And this song is a long explanation of that. And it's nice, it's a literary, metatextual smorgasbord. Sorry, I have a lot of notes on this album. A lot of notes, a lot more than I usually do, because I think a lot about the lyrics. There is one part that I would say I don't like as much. And I don't know about this, okay? And this is part of my big problem with A Murder Most Foul. At one point he says, I've got a telltale heart, like Mr. Poe. Mr. Poe? Who calls Edgar Allan Poe Mr. Poe? Is there some reason for this other than the fact that it fits the meter? And what is up with all these really lazy similes? Is Bob Dylan playing a trick and I am too stupid to understand the brilliance here? If so, please tell me, Professor Skye, you may know a lot about French, but you don't know nothing about Bob Dylan, you goof. Feel free to tell me that. But when I hear a lyric like, a telltale heart like Mr. Poe, I'm like, this is some of the laziest simile writing I've ever heard. It is just terrible. What is the point of this? What is the redeemable quality in this lyric? I've got a telltale heart like Mr. Poe. Please tell me in the comments, why is this not terrible lyricism? Terrible. And I am telling you, Bob Dylan is maybe the greatest lyricist of all time. There's no question about that. But why is this lyric not terrible? Is it just my opinion? I don't know. But there's a nice stuff, there's lots of nice stuff here. Always throughout this album, you never know who he's talking about. So he says, I contain multitudes, and I thought he was talking about himself, but at one point he says, I eat fast foods, and I drive fast cars, and I eat fast foods. So like, is it America? Is this like a Whitman reference where basically, instead of saying I contain multitudes, what he should be saying is I sing a song of America, a different Walt Whitman line that's very famous? And I wonder if that's what this whole thing's about. Like, is this his big ode to America? I think there's a way actually to see this whole album in the context of a meditation on America, that like the rough and rowdy ways are the rough and rowdy ways of America and the history of American music that goes through here, and the weird passing. I'm just improvising right now. This isn't in my notes, so just give me a second here. The weird like bravado and violence between a lot of the lyrics on this album, and then the kind of like vulnerability and sweetness and like the mixture of like art and like swagger. It could be this entire thing is just secretly Bob Dylan's America album. But I'm going to have to think about that while I'm talking to you, which is going to be difficult. But I'll do my best. The next track is False Prophet, a little bit more of a bluesy track again. Here we have some nice lyrics as well. It's weird because this is that other mode I'm talking about, where Dylan's like Mr. Swaggerman. He's like John Wayne. Like, you look at my eyes and you can't resist. And it's very unsettling when people in their, like, senior citizens talk like, no, not senior citizens, when old men make like sexy talk. It's very unsettling, at least for me. But still, there's lots of great lyrics in here. I can't remember when I was born, and I forget when I died. Let's talk about death. I'm going to be talking about death a lot on this album, because a lot of this album is a meditation on death. My problem is, and I saw a lot of people comment online about this album just in my 5 minutes of research. I probably did 20 for this one. It's Bob Dylan, goddammit. But a lot of people saying like, I can't take it if this is his Black Star, if this is like Leonard Cohen and Bowie, if this is his Goodbye album. Hey guys, Bob Dylan released his Goodbye album in 1997. It was great. Just a wonderful, wonderful album. So why not listen to Time Out of Mind? Like, It's Not Dark Yet, but It's Getting There is one of the great I Am Just About to Die and I Know It songs. Like, Bob Dylan's released a lot of Oh My God, I'm About to Die songs. So don't get invested in this one. I think he's got at least another 5 albums left. And that's the other thing that we have to praise Bob Dylan for. Why he's undying and not undead. I think when he could easily be undead and just cash in on what he's already done. But he's been so prolific for so long with no break that it's clear that it's just his inspiration that's forcing him to produce this stuff. The next track, My Own Version of You, is probably my favorite track on the album. It's the good and the bad all here together. Again, kind of a bluesy descending chord situation here. Some terrible like references. Now is the winter of my discontent. Wow. Whoa, what an amazing genius. To quote Richard III. Oh, who would have ever thought of that? But then the rest of it is this super bizarre. Again, this album is grotesque and violent. There's lots of viscera and gore in this album. Very strange. But it's talking about making a Frankenstein monster. I think you could say it's out of a lover that left him, or it could just be about anybody. I would say, potentially, going back to my theory, which I'm working on while I'm talking to you right now, he could be talking about America, the country itself, as a kind of weird Frankenstein monster. Which, of course, if you look at what Frankenstein monster was and what America was, there's a lot of parallels there. Then there's like these lyrics, which are like, are you joking? Are you joking or are you serious, Bob Dylan? And I'm sure you'd say, yes. I'll take the Scarface Pacino and the Godfather Brando, mix it up in a tank and get a robot commando. If I do it right and put the head on straight, I'll be saved by the creature that I create. There are classes, rightfully, dedicated to Bob Dylan and his poetry. There are books, rightfully, written about his poetry and what he's written. I think this is why. You know, like the Ballad of the Thin Man, you know, he like talks about like all these things and it's so fantabulous and weird. But like, if you look at it, those lyrics could be kind of bad. Like, I don't know, wow. I don't know how. He says you're a cow. I got a big plow. I mean, half of those aren't real lyrics. But there is, I believe he does say, and he calls you a cow. Like, there's a sort of blunt force badness to a lot of his lyrics, which I think is intentional and part of what gives them so much strength. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of this Brando Commando figure. But I think it might actually tie in quite nicely to the idea of this whole album being about America. But then there's these other lyrics. Sorry, you're going to hear my dogs running around. It's been an exciting day. We had an order from Instacart come and... Yeah, hey, Bo, could you either go on the couch or on the dog bed, but stop walking around? Here, come here. Have a seat. One second, I have to put the dog bed in the sun. No, that's where I'm talking. I'm talking about Bob Dylan, Bo. Okay. Then later, in the same song, there's an example of the beautiful lyrics he's capable of writing. I'll bring someone to life, someone for real, someone who feels the way I feel. So this is a weird sort of sympathy for Dr. Frankenstein moment that's beautifully made and beautifully done. And really just the kind of lyrics that Bob Dylan's able to write that no one else is able to. The song also kind of reminds me of I Put a Spell on You. Maybe it's the descending chords, or maybe it's just his gravelly old voice. There's something to be said about Bob Dylan's old voice. It's just so different from his young voice. Still on the same song, at one point he says, what would Julius Caesar do? And now I'm going back to the stupid, this whole album's about America theme. Because I think Julius Caesar is an American figure in this song. And the idea of the conquering, there's a whole side to this album, and I'll get into it more. It's all about conquering and ruling. And maybe that's the real question that America asks itself. You know, WWJCD is a famous thing that born-again Christians wear as bracelets. What would Jesus Christ do? And here, what would Julius Caesar do? Maybe that's actually what America does. I don't know. Later, there's an example of a Shakespeare reference, which I think is great. I don't like now must be the winter of my discontent. I think that's just lazy writing. But him asking, can you tell me what it means to be or not to be? You won't get away with fooling me. To me, that's a great lyric because it's taking what Shakespeare did and this existential question and restating it in a new way while emphasizing the fact that we just don't have an answer to that question yet. Do you see the difference? No, 1 second. Do you agree with me that there's a great difference between now is the winter of my discontent and can you tell me what it means to be or not to be? I think one is lazy Dylan, other is great Dylan. I don't know. And again, I'm just some schmuck standing in his living room. I don't pretend to be better than Bob Dylan. I don't criticize him because I think I'm better than him. I criticize him because he's earned it. He's earned the right to be taken seriously and not venerated. Because veneration is death. And I'm going to be a pain in the ass and jump on every single thing that Bob Dylan does that I don't like because I love Bob Dylan that much. Okay. Next is I made up my mind to give myself to you. I've been kind of pooping on Bob Dylan off and on, but I want to say something which is true. Bob Dylan is an underrated. Ooh, is that a Freudian slip? I don't even think so. Bob Dylan is an underrated love song writer. He writes great love songs, and he always has. But I think he's just the voice of the generation and all that we kind of forget it. I would like to see, maybe we'll have to wait till he dies, or maybe before he dies, a collection just of Bob Dylan's best love songs. I don't know what it would look like. If you're one of those Dylan fans who's kind of pissed at me, but you want to contribute to this channel, why don't you do a playlist of the best Bob Dylan love songs? And I think this belongs there with it. So basically the entire, Planet Waves has just got so many great love songs on there. So yeah, anyways, okay. And also on this, his last few albums have been redoing American standards and classics. He's getting in touch with being a crooner. I did a video about seeing him in concert a couple years ago, and I compared him very much to Sinatra, that he reminds me more of Sinatra than he does of Bob Dylan when I saw him in the 90s. And I think we're seeing that he's letting the age of his voice give it character, and then he's working a lot more with phrasing. And I think if we're going to take a more sort of bird's eye view of this album, we would say that this is really where Dylan is allowing his work and study of American crooners affect his phrasing in a positive way. So, I'm mostly saying positive things here, but I'm just trying to be provocative. Okay, Black Rider is quite nice, sparse. Again, it feels like the Black Rider is probably death, but then maybe not. It's unclear what it is. And Bob Dylan's strength is in the ambiguity about himself and about what he's saying, that he's able to push forward always. Great instrumentation. Again, I think this would fit perfectly into Time Out of Mind from 1997. You just put that right in there. Another kind of great I'm Gonna Die album. Mother of Muses is another great track. That's why on the whole this album is just really super strong. It really is. It's all about inspiration. It's sort of a cross between a dirge and a lullaby. It's a dirgeaby. I just came up with that right now. I'm not proud. It's kind of another sort of close to death song, but it's about trying to find the source of inspiration. It feels like he's maybe making a reference to Homer and the Odyssey by talking about the muses, which is fine, right? I think that doesn't feel too belabored to me. And then he does something which I am going to spend a good couple minutes on. And that is this one lyric. And this is, I think, one of the great saving graces of the album is the following lyric. And of Zhukov and Patton and the battles they fought, who cleared the path for Presley to sing, who carved a path for Martin Luther King, who did what they did and went on their way. Man, I could tell these stories all day. This is what Murder Most Foul could have been. And in fact, this one verse might redeem Murder Most Foul. My problem with Murder Most Foul is that it is not worthy of Dylan's intelligence, brilliance, and significance. To me, it is too much the greatest hits of the 60s and 70s. It's too much CNN decades. It is too much We Didn't Start the Fire, but just better. It's an unchallenging look at boomer history given to boomers by the undead boomer Jesus. This track, this line, is completely different because he's challenging us and challenging our concept of history. He is deracializing American history in a beautiful way. Zhukov, a great Russian general, my son tells me, he knows a lot more about history than I do, and Patton, and the battles they fought, who cleared the path for Presley to sing. So already we have the concept that it was American militarism, the great bugaboo of the hippies and the great boomer Jesus himself. It was the American military and the Russian military and their successful fight against Nazis and fascism that paved the way for Elvis to show up. Already that's a pretty controversial, unsettling connection to make. If it weren't for Patton, one of history's great successful jerks, okay, terrible person, great general, okay, if it weren't for Patton, we wouldn't get Elvis. Already, if you're a hippie, like I am at my heart, even though I have my problems, the idea of crediting the popularization of rock and roll with Patton is very disconcerting. And Dylan does that in just one line in the middle of this song. So you're just like, good. Okay, well, you couldn't possibly challenge me any more than that, Dylan. Make me credit Patton with Elvis Presley. He's not done. Elvis Presley carved the path for Martin Luther King? No, you see, you're forgetting, Bob, that Elvis stole everything from black musicians. So to say that he carved the path for Martin Luther King is a travesty and is racist. It's not. This is the brilliance of Bob Dylan. This is his vision, being able to see things and say things that I would never have thought to say or see or think in a million years. I think I could have written A Murder Most Foul in an afternoon if you told me the general outline. I don't think if you gave me 10,000 years I could have written a line as important and as disarming as Elvis carved the path for Martin Luther King. He's cutting through so much of our modern take on Elvis, partly due to, Public Enemy calling him a racist. I don't think Elvis was a racist. I do think he was a product of a racist society. I do think his success was partly due to the fact, I know, that American culture could only accept rock and roll if it came from a white voice. But still, if it weren't for the rock and roll revolution, and this is all credit to the boomers who I appear to be, making fun of, but I'm not. If it weren't for Elvis singing for the boomers and expanding their mind and giving them rock and roll and just exploding everything, the path for Martin Luther King wouldn't have been there. The expansion of the mind, the accepting of a black culture, the sort of destruction of a lot of pre-war values wouldn't have actually arrived there. So just in these 3 lines, he has done more than he did in those 19 minutes about JFK being shot. And he does more than I think almost anybody I can think of about recontextualizing post-war American history and de-racializing it completely. Because it's true. America couldn't have accepted Martin Luther King without Elvis coming first. That doesn't mean Martin Luther King owes gratitude to Elvis or that Elvis made Martin Luther King. Obviously not. Martin Luther King, totally separate. But his view of history, I believe, is totally just. How to connect those 3 people, Patton, Elvis, and Martin Luther King. And he did it well. Now also, he says, man, I could tell their stories all day. There is a part of this album that feels a little bit like just an old guy who likes to hear himself talk. And as a middle-aged guy who likes to hear himself talk, I can recognize it. But there's a little bit about that on this album where I sort of get the sense it might be good if he worked with a producer who could push him back a little bit, could push him around a little bit, tell him what to do and what not to do. But it's fine. Next track, Crossing the Rubicon, is a very kind of standard blues track. This is answering the question he asked before. What would Julius Caesar do? Julius Caesar himself, that's where the term comes from. He crossed the Rubicon River, and when he did that, that was the sign that democracy was over in Rome, and the Roman Republic was over, and the Roman Empire was here. Once Julius Caesar crossed that river, it was clear, I'm done with democracy, I'm becoming an empire. This fits pretty well with my theory that this whole album is actually a meditation on America, because America crosses the Rubicon fairly often. Or it's just a personal song about him having swagger, because there's this whole other side where there's a real swaggering side to this. Is this Bob's swagger? Is this America's swagger? I don't know. But it's weird because crossing the Rubicon is not a good thing. Historically, it's not a good thing to cross the Rubicon. It's a sign that you're a tyrant. But it's nice. It's a good song. The chord progression's a little bit boring. This is one thing that's interesting, right? So I've been giving Bob Dylan grief for lines like, I've got a telltale heart, like Mr. Poe. I still can't get over that Mr. But here, like, one of the most famous things about crossing the Rubicon, and certainly Bob Dylan would know this, is that this is when Julius Caesar said, the die has been cast. So how did he not say that? If Bob Dylan is this, like, hacky, simile-throwing faux intellectual that I have almost accused him of being at times, why would he not do? There's even a line where it would have worked. He says, how long can this last? And that would have been perfect. He could have said, the die has been cast. So once again, I have to say, it's entirely possible that all of my negative commentary on here will be, I will go back on it. Because maybe he's just working at a level that I don't understand. I obviously respect my intelligence a lot, and some of you may be thinking too much. But there's a real good shot that even that Mr. Poe line is just as brilliant as the Martin Luther King line, and I just don't see it yet. I don't know. The next track is called Key West, Philosopher Pirate. This gets credit as being the only Bob Dylan song, which if you gave me the title and said Bob Dylan song or Jimmy Buffett song, I would say, that's got to be a Jimmy Buffett song. Philosopher Pirate, yeah, that sounds like Jimmy Pirate. Key West, but this is just great. And once again, Bob Dylan's ability to have obscure metaphors. What is he talking about? Is he actually talking about Key West? Is he actually talking about heaven? I believe the whole idea is that this is another end-of-life song, and that Key West is the furthest most point off of Florida. And so I believe the whole idea is that he's at the edge of the sea, at the edge of where America ends. I think he could have done, I looked it up on a map, Cape Flattery, Washington, and it would have had the same idea, that this is the outer limits. And I think you could say that he's talking about just being in a nice place and relaxing where the bougainvillea is there. Or you could say he's talking about heaven because it feels like the place he's talking about is too idyllic to be true. There's no seasons, everything's beautiful. But I think more it's about this stage of his life where he's at the end of his life and he's at the edge of the country. He's at the very edge of everything, almost in the ocean. And I would say the ocean represents death, represents the afterlife, and he's just right there on Key West. And he mixes it in, talking about Truman and I think maybe even Hemingway. So he makes it real enough that it could just be a song written by the Key West Tourism Bureau. But I don't think so. I think that's what this is. And if we go back to this other theory that I'm slowly working on, about this maybe being all about America, that would make sense, as it is one of the last points where America stops being America. It's at the very edge. I'm just realizing now I didn't mention Goodbye Jimmy Reed. I just don't like that song. I just don't like it. I mean, I'm happy that he shoots out, he gives a shout out to a great blues guy, and part of the duty of somebody like Bob Dylan is to constantly throw you back to other people. I wouldn't have discovered Jimmy Rogers if I hadn't read about him in a Bob Dylan interview, right? And I love Jimmy Rogers, but I only know about him because of Bob Dylan. So it's nice to do that. I would say, thinking about it, that in a way, a lot of the late stage Bob Dylan seems to be very Jimmy Reed directed. In particular, his biggest hit, Baby, What You Want Me to Do. It feels like at times Bob Dylan is just trying to write Baby, What You Want Me to Do again. that that's his goal. That's what he's aiming for, is to write a song that good or that catchy. I don't know. So there you go. Why would you listen to this album? You listen to this album because everything Bob Dylan does is worthy of study. It's worthy of understanding in the larger context of his work. And I think when he does finally pass, when he's recorded his last album, who cares when he dies? When he's recorded his last album, we will be given this great gift of all these different phases and all these different things to understand. So you should listen to this album to get ahead, to help figure it out. You know, we should definitely not be listening to Highway 61 Revisited anymore. At this point, we should only be listening to, you know, this, or Shot of Love, or Knocked Out Loaded, or any of the other kind of lesser works that are still made by the greater genius. Okay, well, I gotta turn the air conditioning back on. I'm getting a little bit hot here. I look forward to all of your comments about this. I am very, I know everything, but I really don't. I really don't. I just, you know, it's more engaging if I act arrogant. But anyways, put in the comments what you want to say to me. Okay, until next time, there's the camera.